The sorry was kind of written in a different pen, maybe just before he knew he was going to do it, I don't know. And maybe it was a final sort of, I'm sorry about what I'm leaving behind, but I don't think Paul realised what he'd be leaving behind. When someone takes their own life, it's very much their decision. They have chosen to do that. And for the children, it was kind of, weren't we worth sticking around for?
In those notes that he had left that you found afterwards, there was an outline of a plan, which was to bring the children down in front of you one by one, which we see in the documentary, one by one, to take their lives, take your life, and then take his own. Do you think in some ways that he took his own life enabled to protect himself and protect you from doing that? How do you think autism changes or affects a grieving child?
Oh, I know I did my best. I know I tried everything I could try. Mm-hmm. There was nothing more I could have done, and I've had to come to terms with that and forgive myself for it not being different. The most heartrending messages we've had from all around the world are people saying, I watched the film and you saved my life because I was planning my suicide. And seeing what I'd be leaving behind, I've now decided not to do it.
So Vikie, it was the 15th of September 2007, which was the day that your husband took his own life, leaving behind you and your 7 children. And I know that you've talked about this story so much because I've seen so many interviews over the years, and you did the wonderful documentary for Neflix as well, Kingdom of Us, which is still on Netflix today and I've seen multiple times. And it really paints a true and quite a raw image, really, of the aftermath of that day.
Yeah.
On that day, how do you think your role as mum in the house changed?
Oh, in a multitude of ways, because it was interesting. People watching this probably don't know the story, so it's worth pointing out that my husband had a lot of mental health issues. Mm-hmm. So life had already been very difficult for all of us. And I had felt as though, to a large extent, the children were my responsibility rather than Paul's. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it didn't feel as though it changed an awful lot, but obviously that support was gone. So all of a sudden, I had to do everything. Mm-hmm. Instead of my sort of conventional bits that I was used to doing. So suddenly mm-hmm. I had to do all the accounts, which he normally did because I was still running the business. Mm-hmm. And I also, you suddenly have to try and be 2 parents. Mm. And I know from talking to my children, now they're a lot older, that not having a father's influence has had a massive impact on them, especially on Osborne, because he's the only boy. So he was living with 7 women, which wasn't easy for him. I mean, people mm-hmm. joke about it and we joke about it, but actually it wasn't easy for him because he didn't have a male role model in his life.
Did he feel a need at all to step into Paul's shoes to fill that role in the house?
Yeah. He did, and he suddenly felt as though he was, and unfortunately, within a few weeks of Paul dying, someone said, oh, Osborne, you're the man of the house now. And he was only 8, but he took that very much to heart and felt that he did have to be the man of the house. And of course, he wasn't able to, but it affected the way he behaved, because he would hide his feelings so that I had more time to help everyone else who was struggling. So he kind of struggled alone a lot, mm-hmm. which is terribly sad. And I tried to give them all equal input, but the girls were much more needy than he was. So inevitably, he kind of got left in this situation where he felt as though he was supporting all of us, even at that tender age.
How difficult was that for you to divide your time amongst 7 children, and not just your time, but 7 grieving children in particular?
Incredibly hard. I mean, it is hard because you do have a limited amount of time, but I was very aware that when I was with one of them, I should give them my absolute full attention and not be half with them. So I was very careful about that, and sometimes it would be 2 or 3 of them, and I would try to give them all the attention they needed. But you can't be in that situation with so many children and not really be there. And I had my own struggles and my own mental health issues going on. But I was very conscious of what they were going through and how young they were. And my own mother died when I was 15. So I know how it felt to lose a parent when you're very young. Not as young as Pip, but she was only 6. But I knew how that felt. So at least I had some kind of awareness of that necessity to be very, very present with them and try to be that person they needed.
And how do you even begin to help a child to grieve?
Oh, do you know what? I still ask myself that question, because there isn't one answer, because although they are 7 children with the same parents, they're so different. They're so incredibly different. And they grieved in very different ways. And I think some of them still haven't really grieved in the way they needed to. And I think when it comes to suicide, it's a very different type of grief. I was thinking about this the other day. Romance is the wrong word, but you can't romanticize suicide. If someone dies in a car crash, you can say, well, they were such a careful driver and it shouldn't have happened, and you know, it's a terrible tragedy. If someone dies from cancer, you can say, well, they fought so hard and they were so brave and it wasn't fair. But when someone takes their own life, it's very much their decision. They have chosen to do that. And for the children, it was kind of, weren't we worth sticking around for? And that was their sort of feeling about it. And there was no answer to that. I couldn't give them any answers. And sadly, his suicide note, when they were all old enough to read it, that didn't give them any comfort either, because in that he said, good luck spending the rest of your lives with your mother. So
what did he mean by that?
Well, I mean, we'll never really know, will we? But the suicide note was 13 pages long, completely blaming me for everything. And obviously I took some responsibility in what happened, but I don't take responsibility for his death. Excuse me. I've learnt over the years that you can't take responsibility for someone taking their own life, because I don't think it would have mattered what we'd done. I don't think it would have changed anything. In order to maintain your sanity, you have to arrive at that point.
And how did the children, or do the children even understand that now, that it wasn't their fault? Because I know the children at such a tender age can take some of the responsibility of what happens between their parents.
Yeah, they still do. They still talk about, what if I'd phoned him? What if I'd done this? What if I'd done that? In the film, Jamie says she wishes she'd been older to understand better. And, you know, they all still have things they say. What if we'd gone down to the car and spoken to him? And of course, it's the what ifs that will kill you if you're not careful, because there is no answer to those what ifs. You know, we don't know if we'd intervened in some way that morning. Would he have done it in the afternoon? Would it have happened a week later? You don't know. And you can never answer those questions. So you have to arrive at some kind of peace with that. And that's very hard to do, because it's not a real peace. It's kind of a false acceptance of that.
Are you at that place now? Have you been able to do that?
To a degree. To a degree. I feel at peace with myself because I tried for so long to get him to seek help for his mental health issues. And I couldn't have done anything more. Sadly, you can't make a third person referral for someone. And to be honest with Paul, he was so paranoid. I mean, paranoid in the medical sense of the word. But even if I had been able to get him an appointment and get him to go to it, he wouldn't have trusted the doctor enough to take the advice because of the paranoia. So actually sometimes with people's mental illness, there's actually nothing you can do because of the nature of the illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I did my best. I know I tried everything I could try.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing more I could have done. And I've had to come to terms with that and forgive myself for it not being different. Because obviously Paul dying wasn't the best thing for the children, but it happened. So you have to come to terms with that. It's very hard for the children still.
And because you have 7 children leaning on you for support, and you said there your mum passed away when you were quite young as well, very young in fact. Where do you get your support from? Where do you lean on?
Nowhere.
Nowhere.
Actually, my family, when Paul died, my family consisted of a brother who lived in Cambridge in care, and he was severely autistic. And you couldn't have a relationship with Tony, and he wasn't in a place where he could offer any assistance. And an elderly uncle who lived in Manchester, who was too far away and too elderly to really be able to help. And since my brother died 2 years ago, my uncle's now nearly 90. So that was the sum total of my family. And when Paul died, because he blamed me absolutely 100% for him doing it, his whole family turned against me. His parents refused to have anything to do with me, which meant the children then couldn't see their grandparents. So they lost, and Paul had a very, very large extended family. And we all lost all of those people that they'd grown up with. Suddenly weren't there and were never going to be there again, because Paul's mother had, if you like, poisoned their beliefs or their image of me, and that I was completely at fault and he wouldn't have died if it hadn't been for me. So there was absolutely no one.
What happened when you went to bed at night and there was silence and you're with your own thoughts? What were those thoughts?
A lot of those thoughts were about, how on earth am I going to get through tomorrow? I developed a strategy. I never looked at my diary until the night before, the next day. And then I would look at it and think, okay, so I've got to drop that child there, pick that one up from there, take that one there, get myself to there. And I'd kind of work it out the day before, because if I looked too far ahead in my diary, it was too daunting. I think I'd have given up before I'd even tried. So that would be a large part of it. And then very often I would cry myself to sleep, because that was the only opportunity I had to release any kind of emotion that had built up during the day. And anyone who has children on the autistic spectrum knows the challenges that comes with that. And very often what one needed was diametrically opposed to what another one needed. And how do you keep them both happy? And of course you can't. So, you know, it's complicated. It's complicated.
And how do you think autism changes or affects a grieving child?
Oh, I think the biggest challenge an autistic child has with death in particular is that it's very abstract. It's, you know, Paul was there on the Friday and wasn't there on the Saturday. And that doesn't make sense. And also the person is still there in your head. And for an autistic person, that's very difficult to kind of, to marry up those two things. You know, he's still there, but they can't see him. He's not there in real life. So the grieving process when you're on the autistic spectrum, I think, is a much more complicated thing, because you can't understand the reality of someone suddenly not being there because they've died. And certainly Pippa had no idea what death was.
How old was
she thought the funeral was a party. She was 6 when he died. And she just couldn't get her head round it at all. And obviously that affects a child when they can't begin to understand what's happened. And especially when someone's made that choice themselves. You can't say, oh, it was a car crash and it shouldn't have happened, but it has. You know, the fact that someone's actually made that ultimate choice to take themselves away from the world doesn't make sense. And autistic children, a lot of them have a tendency to be very logical, and there's no logic in that. And also they find it hard to get in touch with their emotions and understand their emotions. And if you can't understand your emotions, you can't process them. So it becomes very, very complex, just trying to understand what's happened and why, and understanding why you're feeling so awful, but not quite understanding why and not being able to express it.
And because if they're unable to express it, was this even more worrying for you as a mum, because maybe you just wanted a child who could just cry so you knew what to do, but if the emotions aren't there, was it more difficult for you to know what to do?
It was. I mean, fortunately, I know my children very well, and I had a massive understanding of how they worked when Paul died. I'd already built up that understanding. So I had other signs that I could, if I hadn't worked so hard to understand them, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But I was able to look at each one and think, I know you're not okay. I know you're struggling with this. And of course, a lot of it showed up in school as well. And they had difficulties at school. But, you know, trying to explain to teachers what was going on, because very often they would laugh when that wasn't appropriate, you know. And it happens a lot with autistic people that they'll smile or they'll laugh when they're being told off. And it's not that they're being disrespectful, it's their way of coping with it, and it's their way of not understanding that's not an appropriate response, but it's the only response they can give. And a lot of kids get into trouble at school because people don't understand that aspect of their behaviour. So you have to really know your child in order to be able to offer appropriate support. But to be honest, a lot of the time it was really, really hard to know what to do. I mean, with a neurotypical child, it's hard. But trying to explain that he's not coming back, and yeah, it was, I did my best, but I'll never know whether I did the right thing. Do you know what I mean? It's impossible to know.
How do you think you've done?
People constantly tell me that the children are amazing, and I am extremely proud of all of them. So they've turned out, as the term goes, very, very well. They're all very respectful, very caring, very law-abiding. They've not gone off the rails. And I say to people, you know, if anyone had any excuse to go off the rails, it was my kids, because, you know, it was extremely traumatic, and the way it happened on the day was very, very dramatic and traumatic. So they had every excuse under the sun to go off the rails, and they didn't. You know, they kept going at school and did their best, and
do you think
wonderful kids?
Because it was interesting in the documentary when you talk so much about you felt that you could have done more to protect them, or that you could have protected them at all. Since then, do you think you've done a good enough job of protecting them?
I think I've done my best to protect them since he died. I think under the circumstances and with everything that was going on, I do feel at peace that I absolutely did my best. And to be honest, when I look back at the situation before Paul died, there really wasn't much I could have done. It was a very, very complex situation with Paul and with his difficulties. And a lot of what I did was in order to keep better peace for the sake of the children. So, you know, people say, why did you have 7 children? Well, because Paul wanted them, and it was easier to have another baby than it was to deal with the fallout if I'd said no. And people can't get their heads around that. And I understand that, because it sounds crazy, but that was the reality we were living in. So my way of protecting them was to try and keep Paul as level as I could, because I think he may have had a split personality or dissociative identity disorder, because he was very much 2 different people, and the children were very, very scared of the other Paul. And they could kind of tell by the way he'd done his hair
Mm-hmm.
And every day I would pick them up from school, and the first question they would all ask me was, what mood is Daddy in?
Mm-hmm.
And, if I said, oh, no, he's fine. I mean, by the time I got home, he might not be fine. But, if I said, oh, no, he's fine, they'd sort of, oh. And if I said, well, oh, they'd be, oh, terrified. So it was a horrible environment for them to grow up in. So I was trying constantly to temper that and do what I could to keep Paul happy, if you like.
Keep the peace in the house between everyone.
Yeah, keep the peace, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But yeah, I know there will be people watching this, not just women, but men as well, who will, maybe watch this and think, yeah, I'm in that situation as well. That's what I'm doing, and they will relate to it. And if you've not been in an abusive relationship, I think you can't understand it. You can't begin to understand it because it's not logical.
And in those notes that he had left that you found afterwards, there was an outline of a plan, which was to bring the children down in front of you one by one, which we see in the documentary, one by one, to take their lives, take your life, and then take his own. Do you think in some ways that he took his own life enabled to protect himself and protect you from doing that?
That's what the children like to believe. Exactly that. And I suppose, yes, I get some comfort from that as well, because having lived with Paul and lived in the situation, I was very afraid of him and what he was capable of doing. And now I look back and I think, that was a very real possibility that could have happened. And all the signs were there. But the children like to think that nice Daddy, as they call him, decided that he had to take himself away so that the bad side of him didn't do that. And I think that brings them quite a lot of comfort. And it brings me some comfort in hoping that that's the reason he did it. The suicide note kind of belies that, but I hold on to that because it does give me an element of comfort to think that he was actually trying to protect us all.
And the last word in that suicide note was sorry. Do you think that he was asking for forgiveness by saying sorry?
I don't know, because that was written almost as an afterthought. I mean, the suicide note was written in two parts, and the first half-ish was dated in August, and then the second half wasn't dated, so we don't know if he wrote it on the day he did it or what. We don't know. But the sorry was kind of written in a different pen, maybe just before he knew he was going to do it. I don't know. And maybe it was a final sort of, I'm sorry about what I'm leaving behind. But I don't think Paul realised what he'd be leaving behind. And he'd always said to me in all the years we'd been together that if anything happened to him, there was no way I would manage. So I don't know. I mean, it kind of feels as though his suicide possibly was a way of getting revenge on me, believing that I would fall apart. And in his state of mind, he wasn't thinking about the children, because you're not in a good frame of mind if you're going to take your own life. You're not in a logical place. So, you can speculate until you're blue in the face, really, but never actually get any answers. And actually, a close friend of ours has took his life recently, and watching their family go through the same different situation, because it was their son, but watching them go through the same process of the questions and just the desperation of never knowing if there's something you could have done, or was it your fault, or did you cause it? It's a truly horrendous thing to go through because of the lack of answers, really, to a large extent.
How have you got to the stage where you are at now, making peace with the what ifs and making peace with the event itself? It's
been a case of having to, because, like I said, the what ifs will kill you.
Mm.
And I have developed a lot of strategies to try and help me to come to terms with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken a lot of work.
Mm.
But I suppose it's trying to keep my anxiety levels down.
Mm.
So I try desperately to respond instead of reacting, not just to other people, but to my own thoughts. So when I have a thought that isn't helpful, rather than going, oh, I try to think, okay, well, where's that come from? And what purpose is it serving? And how can I counter that? And is it actually helpful? And should I be listening to that? So it's trying to keep that peace within yourself instead of allowing your anxiety levels to rise and to get panicky about things. And it's something you have to learn. It's not something that happens overnight. And I've worked really hard on it for so many years now. But it's really helpful because it does allow you to think more clearly and to not let your chimp brain run away with you and tell you that things are wrong or that you should have done this or should have done that. It gives you the space to actually think, yeah, okay, that's okay. I know I didn't do that, and I know that, I know my story. I mean, the sad thing is that, my story is well known, but Paul can never tell his story. And his story obviously would be very different because his perception of what happened over the years would be very different to mine. And I would love to hear his story and hear his perception because it would be very useful. But of course, we can't do that now. So you can only guess and try and, like the children do in the film, try and piece together the jigsaw puzzle to try and work out what he was thinking and what was going on in his head and where he was coming from.
And is that something that you and the family are still doing? Is there pieces of the puzzle that you still want to know, that you still want to put together? Or have you made peace that maybe the puzzle is all there? Let's find a way to live with this.
Yeah, we're kind of there. But then every so often someone will have a memory and go, oh my God, I'd forgotten about that. And then, of course, that leads to all sorts of other questions. So you think you've sort of put it to, well, you never put it to bed, but you think that you've kind of, put that acceptance to one side and done it the best you can to come to terms with it. And I have memories sometimes. Suddenly I'll think, I've forgotten that happened. And then that sparks a whole load of different questions and that will spark more memories. And writing the book was cathartic in some ways, but quite traumatic in others, because I had to really delve into my memory to remember all the things that had happened. And some of the things that I'd think of would spark other things and would leave me sort of, oh, how did I let that happen? How did that occur? So, yeah, you think you've kind of put it to bed, but every so often something comes up. And things like Christmas Day, the anniversary of his death, his birthday, things like that tend to be real trigger points, those sort of memories. And, people, oh, do you remember this? And but I think the good thing now is that we can talk about it and we can discuss it as a family. And there will be tears, but not to the same desperate degree.
And that's really interesting what you say about talking about it as a family, because that was really poignant in the documentary, is how open you are with your children to give them a space to talk and express themselves in any way they wish to, and just talk about their feelings or their thoughts. Was that intentional from you, that you said, I'm going to give all of my children space, or did that just naturally happen as a mother?
No, that was quite deliberate, because I felt that they needed to be able to express themselves in their own way, because they were experiencing it so differently. And I suppose I always tried to run the house as a democracy. So any decisions that were made, we would talk it through and try to come to a group decision on it. whilst at the same time they always understood that if we couldn't come to an agreement, then they would have to accept that as the head of the household, I would have to make the final decision. And they were all very comfortable with that because they always had a say. Excuse me. But, you know, when it came to allowing them to express their feelings, you have to. If you're always shutting them down, then those emotions never come out, and those feelings and those thoughts never come out. And that's not healthy. Keeping everything inside isn't healthy. You have to be able to express them. And, you know, they struggle to express those feelings in the first place anyway. So to try and stop them from doing it would have been very damaging. And I was very aware of that. So I did try to be very, very conscious. You know, and there's a bit when we're talking about getting rid of the Atlas, which is a caravan that Paul moved into in the end. And, you know, Pippa's really upset and says, you know, it sounds stupid, but there's nowhere for him to live if he comes back. Now, she was very young when he died, and she was still very young when that was filmed. And yes, of course, we all know logically he can't come back. But if that's her way of dealing with it and that helps her, then that mustn't be invalidated. You have to accept that that's the case and understand it and be accepting of it. Because what else can you do? You know, if you shut her down and say, well, that's ridiculous, then how's that making her feel? How's that helping her? It's not. So I think, you know, it's very important. I know a lot of families are very closed off, especially about suicide. You know, it's a taboo that you don't talk about. And one of our biggest motivations for making the film, or one of my biggest motivations for what I do ongoing, is to try and get rid of that taboo. You know, that it must be talked about, and you must be able to express your feelings as best you can about it. What keeps me going now is just trying to help people to understand that it is okay to not be okay, because I know we hear that all the time, but people still don't actually believe it. I want people to ask twice. You know, if you ask a friend, you know, we all do it, don't we? You know, how are you? And they say, oh, I'm fine. And we go, okay, and off we go. And we really have got to start asking someone if they're okay and meaning it, and looking at them and thinking, I don't think you are okay. I'll say, are you sure you're okay? Do you want to have a coffee? You know, do you want to talk about things?
Exactly what you do in your family, which is sometimes you don't have the answer. Sometimes you can't give advice or suggestions, but what you see in your family is you just sit on a sofa with them and just let them talk.
Yeah.
Allow them to just get whatever in their head out and just listen.
Yeah. And that's what they need. And we still do that. I still have massively long conversations with all of my children where it's really them talking and me just saying, well, you know, did that work for you? You know, but the great thing is they will come to me with the worst things that children would normally desperately hide from their parents. And I always just say, well, okay, you know, how was it? And very often they'll say, actually, it was absolute rubbish and I'll never do it again. You know, but they do tell me things, which is fantastic, because it means that I am able to let them talk it through and come to their own conclusions normally. The most helpful thing is that they draw their own conclusion, not that I tell them that it's wrong. And that's much more powerful. Self-awareness is more powerful than someone going, no. So yeah, I'm very, but yeah, we still do that with all of them. You know, they all still come in and go, and talk and just get it out, and you know.
And you're obviously very proud of them. Are you proud of yourself for the way they've turned out?
Proud of myself, I don't know. I think as a parent, you always feel you could have done better, and you always question what you could have done differently. But yeah, I am proud of how they've turned out. I am proud of my children. They are very, very good people, and they are aspiring to achieve their dreams. And you know, it's difficult for a lot of them at the moment because of COVID, but that's the same for a lot of people. So, you know, I totally empathise with people who are really struggling this year. But generally speaking, when the world is working normally, whatever normal is going to be in the future, but when it's working normally, you know, they are very conscious of what they want to do and whether they're really achieving their full potential or, you know, what's next. And so it's great, you know, but they all do, they're all good people, you know, they don't ever hurt anyone deliberately, and they really try to help people. And, you know, their ethos behind the film was, this is really painful, and especially seeing it for the first time, the finished article was incredibly difficult for all of us. But we all agreed that we hoped it would help some people. And actually we've had, I mean, the most heartrending messages we've had from all around the world are people saying, I watched the film and you saved my life because I was planning my suicide. And seeing what I'd be leaving behind, I've now decided not to do it. And we have had dozens, possibly well over 100 of those messages. And that's incredibly empowering to think that something as devastating as Paul's death can actually be turned into something so positive that's helped so many people. And that, in a way, is quite cathartic and helps a little bit to rationalize his death. Not completely, but it's quite soothing to receive all of the wonderful messages that we get from people. It's, you know, it's lovely. It really is.
You've done a good job, Vikie.
Thank you. I hope so.
We have.
I really did try. That's the thing. I can always put my head on my pillow at night and say, I've tried my best. You know, today I tried my best. And you can't ask more of anyone.
That's all any of us can do. It's true. Yeah. Thank you, Vikie.
Oh, thank you, Rory. It's been an absolute pleasure.